Hey guys, it's Caitlin. I'm going to be talking about the Paradoxical Era from 1968 to 1980. Richard Nixon wins narrow presidential victory over Hubert Humphrey as a Republican candidate. Nixon was seen as a hypocritical president because in his first term he often supported democratic reform and took credit for them. However, in his second term he often vetoed a plethora of reforms. Nixon wanted to revamp the nation's welfare program by establishing a family assistance plan to replace the AFDC. This would provide federal assistance to all families who fell beneath a federally prescribed minimum income. Although FAP was defeated, its SSI provision was enacted in 1972. SSI proposed to federalize these adult programs. They were not seen under controversy because of veterans coming back from war with disabilities, and older persons were held to a higher standard. They were not seen as to immorally be taking funds. The Local Fiscal Assistance Act of 1972 gave funds to local governments to use for their operating expenses. Nixon believes that it will replace many of the existing federal programs. However, some of these state and local governments used it for non-reasonable expenses. Nixon wanted to keep the southern states happy, so he didn't support desegregation of southern schools in 1969 and 1970. However, the federal courts insisted, and Nixon finally relented and created a series of southern committees that succeeded in securing voluntary desegregation. African American students in segregated southern schools was reduced from 68% in 1968 to 8% in the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972, which gave Commission the power to use court rulings to enforce its orders. He then created the Philadelphia Plan, which required building contractors that obtained federal contracts to institute affirmative action, which created much more employment for those of color and women. He then created the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which protected those with disabilities from discrimination. The Family Planning and Population Research Act of 1970 helped 4 million low-income women obtain family planning services by 1980. Also, Roe v. Wade federally legalized abortion. The Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970 was landmark legislation that propelled the federal government into oversight of safety standards in American industry, in an era when toxic chemicals and new technology demanded new protection. The Housing and Community Development Act of 1974 established the Section 8 housing program to pay up to 70% of the housing costs of tenants who rent from private landlords. Eligibility is determined by the household income of tenants. During Nixon's presidency, the United States declared war on cocaine, heroin, and marijuana. They devoted far more resources to increasing the supply of illicit drugs than reducing the demand. They virtually had no social or substance abuse services, job training, or educational services, so many resumed their drugs after leaving prison only to go back. He got caught in the Watergate scandal and resigned in August of 1974. His preceding presidents were Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. They were relatively uneventful.